So I will hand straight over to Farah Morley, who has been good enough to join us this morning from Cardiff. Farah is a Muslim author and writer, amongst many other things, and she's going to speak to us about the general religious perspective on why we should be concerned about where our money is going. So Farah, I'll hand over to you for your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The ethics of finance is central to our role as believers. The wealth that we have at hand in this life is a boon that will have to be accounted for in the next. The implementation of our moral and religious beliefs is key to how we pursue monetary gain, which is a legitimate goal separate to the money we donate to charity. The Quran tells us not to consume wealth unjustly. It commands us to let our trade be trade that creates mutual contentment. Both parties are mutually content with the outcome. The verse in chapter Rahman, which means the merciful, deals succinctly with the issues central to what is happening globally in the international markets. The disparity that exists within the economic framework, the unfair trade as opposed to the fair trade that allows for the satisfaction of one party at the cost of the other, are not considered by Muslims to be permissible. I often tell my teenagers that purchasing is a moral action. If you think you're getting a cheap commodity, a good deal, whether it be food or fashion, remember it comes at a cost. If you are not paying the cost, then someone or something else is. In Surah Rahman, God talks about the celestial scale that he has placed between the heavens and the earth for us to find balance. The scales have always been symbolic of justice. We see them in our law courts. We understand that when things are balanced, then justice prevails. That is why the opposite of poverty is not riches. The opposite of poverty is justice. To take more from one than the other is inherently unjust. The Quran talks about this principle in between a verse that discusses the celestial realm and the earthly realm. We place the earth for all living things, and between the heaven and the earth is the balance, the scales. Historically, this has been understood by Muslim scholars to be directly related to economic models for believers. The trade-off is that ultimately between the celestial and the terrestrial, and what we earn and how we earn it will determine our spiritual and worldly wealth. One is not separate from the other. The idea of just commerce is intrinsic to believing people. Historically, in the marketplace, the merchants would have scales so you could witness the just transaction, something that in e-commerce we are removed from entirely. A merchant would put a pound of fruit on the scale and put an equal weight on the other side to show the balance. It forced the merchant to be honest, to promote good practice, because if he was corrupt or unfair in his measure, no customer would return to him. The Islamic tradition is to add extra to tip the scale in the favor of the buyer, because the merchant is seeking a greater profit in the next life than in this one. May God have mercy on those who are generous in trade, the Prophet said. Economics affects all our lives. It affects the lives of tribes that don't even have a concept of money when the timber merchants come for the forests. The false dialectic that has been created between Keynesian and monetary economic theory leaves the world caught between a rock and a hard place with no thought for any alternative. But there is a spiritually cogent alternative that unfortunately is often absent from the discourse. As a Muslim trade is central to how we conduct ourselves spiritually, much of the language of commerce is in fact derived from Arabic terms, as Muslim concepts of free market and ethical investment predate European models. Average, for instance, is an Arabic word, which is derived from the trade agreement that if in the transport of goods some were lost in transit, the average was taken from the value of the lost goods and shared amongst the guild of merchants, so that the weight of the loss would not fall on the shoulders of one merchant or more unjustly the customer. It was an insurance against price fixing and kept inflation steady. The Prophet had two jobs in his life. He was a shepherd and he was a merchant. As a Muslim, we believe that Prophet Muhammad was the last edition of the prophets who came in the right moment to guide us. He is considered, therefore, to be especially pertinent to the issues of our time. He was a merchant before he was a prophet. Is it because the greatest danger to humanity will be the imbalance in global commerce? The merchant is the most beneficial being in society. Every single thing around you is a product of commerce, the benefit of material well-being. The best merchants are those who have the best character. If you're not trustworthy or reliable, you will not succeed. Agriculture and commerce, the two most important aspects to any modern civilization, was the mechanism and models. In the way the prophet dealt with those two societies, one agriculture and one mercantile, was a masterclass in the principles of commerce. When asked by one of the companions where the awareness of God was most absent in the world, the prophet said the marketplace, not a brothel or a drug den or a tyrant's throne, but the marketplace. The honest merchant in Islam is on par with one who has dedicated his life to God. So in a time where we may not have the honest merchant, just the unconscionable market, we have to maintain a constant vigilance. We have to be our own quality control. We have to police the practices and sustain the spirituality. We have to be aware that what makes spiritual sense also makes worldly sense. We have to balance the scales between what something is worth and what it costs. We have begun to commodify everything, believing that what a thing is worth is its true value. Celebrity culture has become so insidious that those who consume it exhume their shallowness and their inability to relate to their reality. Where the artificially cheapened price of something like smoked salmon is in a way redress the cost of dead dolphins, decrease disease antibiotic fish, starved seal pups, and overstretched ecosystems, we cannot afford to ignore the spiritual deficit that's led to the moral bankruptcy in our economic models.
That's great. Thanks so much, Farah, for that really thought-provoking introduction. I especially like the way that you make the comparison between if we don't pay the price for something, then someone else surely is. And I think that's something that we can all think about. So thank you so much. We're now going to hear from Justin Thacker from the Ecumenical Council on Corporate Responsibility, who's going to give us a Christian perspective on investment and talk a bit about when to engage with our institutions and when not to engage and when to divest. So Justin, I'll hand over to you for your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. In the short time that I've got, I want to just share 2 principles and then ask 3 questions that I think are relevant to this conversation we're having today and that arise from my Christian faith. So my first principle is simply this: our money is not ours. It is merely given to us on loan by God. The psalmist tells us, the earth is the Lord and everything in it. Again, every animal in the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. In absolute terms, then, we own nothing, neither money nor possessions. Everything we have is on loan from God. Catholic social teaching describes this in terms of the universal destination of all goods. It's the idea that ultimately everything belongs to God and finds its purpose in God's purposes. So as we consider the investments that we make, whether in terms of savings, ISAs, pensions, or any shares we might hold, the first point to consider is simply this: we are in effect God's fund managers. We're investing somebody else's money, and that person is God. And any good fund manager knows it's the client's priorities that must be our priorities. So what might be God's priorities as we pursue those investments? The second principle I want to make, or point I want to make, is the rather obvious but often overlooked one, that money is powerful. And it's powerful in at least 2 different ways. It's powerful in that those who hold assets and wealth frequently have more power than those who don't. Money can buy you access and influence in the hand of our politicians. It can swing electorates in the hands of lobbyists. It can swing opinions. But at the same time as affording us power over others, money also acts as a power over us. The book of James reminds us that the love of money is at the root of all kinds of evil. And this means then that the desire for more money can cause us to do atrocious things. I have written in the past about the theological ethics of international development. And one of the ideas that comes out of South Africa in particular is the idea that wealth is just as much a problem as poverty. And of course, while those who are poor need to be liberated from the struggles they face, so do the wealthy. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, has written of our need to liberate ourselves from a toxic and unjust situation in which we, the prosperous, are less than human. My point then, again, is simply this: as we continue our investment decisions, if our only goal is to maximize returns for us, then we may be destroying ourselves as much as destroying the lives of others. So what does all this mean for the divestment versus engagement debate? Well, the answer to that is not straightforward, at least not in 5 minutes. I think there's a time to divest and I think there's a time to engage. But I offer just 3 questions for us to consider as we make those decisions. Firstly, is the business in which we are investing of such an atrocious nature, morally atrocious, that there is no justification for any investment at all? And divestment, if we are involved, is the only option. We can certainly imagine, can't we, businesses where this would be the case. For me, any business that explicitly supported slavery, racism, or the arms trade would be a case in point. Second question, is there a reasonable chance that engagement will bring about a change in the business practices? We may have a business that's engaged in activities that we find morally questionable, but our hope is that through continuing our investments and through engaging with them, we can bring about change. But in such circumstances, we must ask ourselves honestly about the prospects for change. For if there aren't any reasonable prospects of change, then again, surely divestment is the only option in respect of that business. And then thirdly, what are our motives in continuing the investment? It's here that we need to be honest with ourselves. Is our motive to change the business's practices, or is it merely to continue with the relatively lucrative stream of investment we have? To what extent is the pursuit of financial rewards driving our decision? Now, of course, examining our own motives is not always easy, but an attempt must be made. So,
30 seconds, Justin, please.
In light of my 2 principles, our money is not ours and our money is powerful, we have 3 questions. Is the business investable at all? Is there a reasonable chance of change? What are our motives? Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. 2 great principles and 3 really thought-provoking questions there, which hopefully we'll have some time to discuss and explore in just a moment. So we've had some general principles, but now as our report focused on nuclear weapons, we're going to try and zero in on that. And we're going to hear now from Kate Hudson, who's going to talk a bit about nuclear weapons and the new United Nations treaty that's come into force this year. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Russell. And can I express real appreciation on behalf of CND for all the work that's been undertaken in this area. It's incredibly useful and it couldn't be more timely because Russell's just referred to the treaty, the new treaty, which was ratified and came into force in January. You know, huge step forward, making nuclear weapons illegal for the first time. All aspects of them, not just use, but possession, production, manufacture, and so on. This is an enormous development, but almost immediately after that development took place, our government has undertaken the most, well, unexpected and very retrograde step in terms of its nuclear arsenal. That's to say, making a decision to reverse the trend for the last 30 years of gradual disarmament and actually increasing the nuclear arsenal. And this is something that's received condemnation not only in Britain, but of course internationally as well. The UN Secretary General has said that it goes against Britain's NPT commitments and so on. So you've got a kind of contradiction here globally between, on the one hand, this kind of enormous drive for global abolition via the TPNW, which is led by countries from the global south. And then on the other hand, this kind of push led now by Britain for nuclear arsenal increase. So it's a very difficult situation. And I think that work around divestment is absolutely crucial. It's a real practical way, particularly in terms of the TPNW, where not only companies and corporations and so on, but also states themselves can take steps towards divestment, and thereby making the development of nuclear weapons more difficult. Just to say a little bit about the Britain's new posture, because it's very interesting and important, because it's not just a question of increasing the arsenal, which is at odds with our legal commitments under the NPT. There's also a change in use posture as well. So currently, Britain takes the position that it would only use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear threat or nuclear use. And now, under the new integrated review, that's changed so that Britain would respond have a nuclear response potentially to other types of threat of seemingly similar magnitude, and they include not only chemical and biological weapons, but new technology. So there's been a big debate around, would we try and nuke a cyber attack? I mean, it's just not a very sensible idea. So there's that, the change in use posture, which can reduce the threshold for nuclear war, and then also moving away from Britain's much vaunted transparency on nuclear weapons. Those of us who've been to the NPT will know that British delegates are always saying, oh, we're the best nuclear weapons states. We put all the information out there about what we have, and we're very transparent and so on. Well, a complete end to that. So on 3 levels, this is a very bad development. But in terms of global resources, it's a very, very bad development when we need to be addressing problems of climate change, national health emergencies, and so on globally, the pandemic problems. And then, of course, on a national level, what does it say about spending priorities of our government? And when the news came out about the arsenal increase, I'm sure you all saw the kind of memes and graffiti and so on, nurses 1%, nuclear weapons 44%, just really starkly showing something about the values of our government when they'd said there was no money for more than a 1% pay rise for those frontline workers who've done so much for us all over the last year. And then this in excess of 40% on weapons of mass destruction. So on so many levels, this is a terrible development. But we do have those strong rays of hope. We have the TPNW, we have initiatives such as this around divestment. And of course, we ourselves, C&D, will be pressing the government to participate in the first TPN States Parties Conference, which will take place in January next year, hopefully as an observer, so they can actually begin to participate. So there are many ways in which we can advance the cause of peace, the cause of eliminating nuclear weapons, and this divestment project is one very powerful way, and we're very strongly in support of it. Thank you, Russell.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. Good to have some hope to look forward to amidst all of the difficult developments of the past 2 weeks. But thank you for all C&D is doing to fight back against these outrages. Our final speaker is Steve Hucklesby. Steve has been leading the work, I think it's fair to say, on this report that the Nuclear Weapons Finance Research Group has put forward. So he's going to talk a little bit about the work of the report and what we can all do to play our part in this divestment campaign. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Russell. And I hope I can also add to bring a little bit of hope to our topic as well, because I'm going to speak to some very practical ways in which we might all be involved in addressing nuclear weapons through our banks and pension funds. There's $1 trillion is being planned by the 9 nuclear weapon states to be spent on nuclear weapons over the next 10 years. I'd like to pick up on something that Justin said, and he talked about how money can inform political discourse and how it can swing politicians. And I'm really quite interested in how the movement of the private sector, the potential for banks and pension funds to disinvest from nuclear weapons could maybe swing the political discourse of nuclear weapons in the UK. Before I come on to that, let me just mention some of the role of our churches in this. You will have seen our churches speaking out on a number of occasions in recent months and indeed over the last few years. So you had the letter, for example, from the Church of England bishops in December calling on the UK government to sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons in order, they said, to give hope to all people of goodwill who seek a peaceful future. I'm not going to go into our theology of nuclear weapons here. I'm not going to attempt that within my 5 minutes, just to say I think that and sometimes we've spoken out as churches individually or as churches together, but sometimes we've spoken out with other faith groups as well. On several occasions with Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and other faith representatives. These faith groups, like churches in their ethical and theological thinking, also can find a moral justification for Britain's nuclear weapons today. And it's a great delight for me to see us speaking together as diverse faith communities together. Let me come on now, though, to banks and pension funds. Let me ask the question, first of all, why should they care? What's in it for them? Why do they care about nuclear weapons? And why do they need to hear from us? The Nuclear Weapons Financing Research Group that Russell's referred to, we did a lot of work around 2019, 2020, engaging with 15 major UK banks and pension companies to look at their policies around nuclear weapons and to look at the extent to which they are exposed to this business. Today, we've launched with ICANN a public letter to NatWest Group, formerly Royal Bank of Scotland, a bank which is heavily government subsidised, asking the NatWest Group to divest completely from companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons. The letter is supported by 40 organisations, and because NatWest is based in Edinburgh, there's a strong Scottish interest. There's an opinion piece in the Herald newspaper in Scotland by Beatrice Finn, the CEO of ICANN. We'd love you to spread around news of this initiative calling on NatWest Group. You'll find that on the ICANN website or on our own project website, which is investinginchange.uk, or in the Joint Public Issues Team Twitter feed, or maybe in the Herald newspaper itself. But coming back to my question, why should banks and pension funds care? Banks and pension funds very rarely disinvest from companies that are involved in dubious activities. So why should the NatWest Bank or your own bank or pension fund cease to do business with companies that are involved in producing nuclear weapons? Now, this is where it really gets quite promising and exciting, because there is one notable exception in the whole of corporate social responsibility where the divestment approach rather than a corporate engagement strategy is employed. And that is around the area of controversial weapons, weapons that are indiscriminate in their effect and banned by international law. So we're talking here about landmines, cluster munitions, chemical and biological weapons. In this area, unlike most other areas of CSR, banks and pension funds appear to acknowledge that funding a company at group level, when doing that, you cannot divorce yourself from the activities such as the development of cluster munitions. This is even the case where that activity may be a small part of that company's overall business. Until now, nuclear weapons have not been considered as controversial weapons, not been considered as weapons deserving of a ban to investment by most banks or pension funds. In the case of banks, the involvement is more likely to be in the provision of commercial loans to those companies or the underwriting of company bond releases. Our argument, therefore, to banks and pension funds is straightforward. Nuclear weapons compromise our security ultimately. They are indiscriminate, and they are now banned by international treaty. with the introduction of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, you must be consistent in your policy. As a bank or pension fund, you must apply the same principles to nuclear weapons that you do to cluster munitions and also to chemical and biological weapons.
30 seconds left, please, Steve.
Thanks. So the logic for our demand, I think, is quite clear. We can argue the moral case, which they might be more difficult for them, but the clearest case is the logic of consistency with their own policy with respect to other forms of controversial weapons. At the end of the day, banks and pension funds are not going to make this move themselves. They need to hear from us. And in the case of some that we've been engaging with, so for example, Nest and People's Pension, which is two of the largest pension funds in the UK, they've said that they will now engage with their members on the question of involvement in nuclear weapons. What we've done through our project website is we've produced a very simple letter that people are able to sign. So send that off to your own bank or your own pension company. That's on the website investinginchange.uk, and you at a click of an email that will go off, and hopefully you should get a response. If we can get a lot of people engaged in this, then my hope is that we can move the money out of nuclear weapons and begin to change the political discourse. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Steve. And Lucy has put a link to the report and to the specific action in the chat function, so you can click straight through from there. And there's also a link that Kate has put in where you can write a letter to the Prime Minister using the CND template letter to oppose the warhead increase. So there's two easy lobbying actions you can take while you're having your lunch this afternoon, which will make a big difference. Okay, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left for some questions, answers, discussions, comments. Because we're on 3 pages, I can't see everyone, so you can either wave your hand frantically and I will try and spot you, or you can use the raise hand function in the chat or on the participant screen. Would anyone, or of course you can still type your message in the chat box. Would anyone like to kick us off with a comment or a question to any of the panelists? Or have they been so comprehensive that there's no questions from anyone? Okay, I'm going to ask a question then while everyone is still thinking of theirs. Kate, can I ask you, you mentioned the ban treaty and the kind of rays of hope. What obviously our government is committed to Trident replacement and committed now to this increase in warheads. What's the level of political opposition like in Parliament, and how is civil society able to bolster that, and kind of how do those two things feed off each other, do you think?
Well, it's difficult in Parliament, unfortunately, in contrast to public opinion. If you look at public opinion, it's absolutely fantastic on this. We had an opinion poll, we commissioned an opinion poll in January by Survation on 2 questions. One was, did people want global abolition of nuclear weapons? And 2, did they want the government to sign up to the TPNW? And there were majorities in favour, significant majorities in favour of both across every single demographic you can imagine, from age, everything, background, how people voted on the Brexit referendum, how they voted in the last election, what party they support, like Conservative Party supporters in their majority supporting both of these things, as well as Labour and so on. So that's the kind of sort of national public opinion situation. But then when it comes to Parliament, it's not so good, to be honest. There are some parties, of course, who have fantastic policy on this. I'm talking about smaller parties. The SNP, of course, in Westminster is absolutely opposed to nuclear weapons and pro the TPNW, Plaid Cymru, the Green Party, and so on. But the other three parties, Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrat, unfortunately, are still in the framework of thinking that, you know, we've got to have nuclear weapons, and we all know the reasons why people come to those conclusions. But it's interesting that there has been something of a shift, and I think this is going to be an increasing shift since the announcement on the warheads. I don't know if colleagues saw or attended our emergency rally in the week of the review came out. It's been viewed by, I think, about 40,000 people now, and we were joined by a Liberal Democrat peer. First time we've had such participation for a while, and she said that the Dems were absolutely appalled by the increase and would be working to oppose it. You know, so I think somehow the increase has shaken people up. Of course, we know that Labour has opposed the increase, although they do not have a position in support of the TPNW, and they support Trident replacement. So there's quite a lot of contradictory positions out there. And I do think that with public lobbying, really raising this issue, people being very concerned internationally, you know, the elders, for example, issued a statement against the increase in the warheads. So I think there's a possibility now that the warhead increase will galvanise opinion, and we may be able to make some progress with our parliamentary representatives, because at the moment, the majority of them are out of step with public opinion, and we need to shift that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Keir Starmer's interview 2 or 3 weeks ago now, wasn't it, said Trident is non-negotiable, but we will uphold our international obligations. Well, our international obligation is to negotiate. Yeah, quite. We're going to negotiate away something that's non-negotiable. Yeah, interesting. Okay, we've had Lucy has posted a link to the CND opinion poll that Kate mentioned there in the chat, so you can have a look at that. Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. One from Anne Lippman. Justin, I think this one's for you. You mentioned about the reasonable chance that engagement will work. Do you have any thoughts on how we might think about how that, you know, how we decide whether that's actually viable or not?
Yeah, sure. I mean, great question. Thank you. I think the bottom line is I would look for track record there. In other words, what I mean is I would look to see if the particular company or whatever that we're talking about has shown evidence of moving in the past on any issue. Now, it may be that changes that they've made haven't been as comprehensive as we would like. I mean, it depends on what the ethical issue is. But what I'm getting at is there any evidence that this business has moved on ethical grounds at all? Now, if they have, then obviously it's not an exact science, but it's some indication that there's also a reasonable chance of movement on whatever issue we're now talking about. But if you've got a business that just hasn't moved, hasn't changed at all in response to pressure, ethical pressure, then that's the kind of company where I'm thinking there does not seem to be a reasonable chance of success, and you're just fooling yourself if you're telling yourself there will be through ongoing engagement. Can I pick up on the second point that Anne raised as well, a question, which was about how can we help them understand that we're all in this together? I think my view on this is that for me, it's probably about priorities. And what I mean is I suspect there's a sense that many people that work in these organizations recognize that there are externalities, you know, as they would put it, but it's just that they prioritize the profit motive above those other issues. So I think it's about helping them understand or helping them recognize that we need a different set of priorities, and that our environmental and social issues need to reach a higher priority than the profit motive that's currently driving them. So it's not about, I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's not about trying to, in one sense, convince them of an issue. It's about convincing them of the relative prioritization of an issue over the money that's being, you know, brought in. And that's a difficult task. I mean, I'm not knocking it, but you know, that's a hard job to do, but that's what the task is. It's about a reprioritization of what really matters.
Great, thank you. Farah, I'll come to you with this one, if I may, first from Ros, about whether you think it's best for individuals to be lobbying banks and pension funds and energy companies that are involved with things that we're not happy with, or whether we should actually just vote with our feet and move our money. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think that it's one or the other. It has to be something that every individual is comfortable with. Different circumstances for people, they might find one thing is easier, but ultimately, if our voice of dissent against the policies that they have holds no sting in its tail, if they're really not concerned about people walking out, it's going to lose its impact. So I think it's all of the above, any of the above, everything really. I think reaching out and joining hands across all sorts of diverse communities. A lot of the time, the invitations are not there. So whether you have an entire community that is espousing exactly the same kind of ideas, if they are not invited to join that platform, they sometimes feel voiceless and disenfranchised from the debate. So I think everything and anything.
Great. And one of the things that's been so good about working on this project has been working in an interfaith way, which I think is really powerful. As you know, I think we've got representatives from many different faiths here this morning, so that's been great as well. Thanks for that, Farah. Steve, I'll come to you with Julie's question here. I'll very briefly answer the first part about how can the UK be increasing its arsenal in light of the nuclear ban treaty. It's sadly because we haven't signed it, so it doesn't apply to us. But Julie goes on to ask about the best way to approach a building society to discover exactly what they're investing their money in. Can you shed some light on that for us, please, Steve?
Yeah, certainly. I think what's important is to understand what the policies are behind the way in which banks or pension companies or building societies invest. So what do they have an intention to try to do some positive investment, to do investment for good? Do they have a policy that seeks to prevent from doing harm? That typically is an exclusion policy, which would then screen companies to work out which companies might contravene some of their corporate ethical standards. So the best way probably is to approach this on a policy basis rather than company by company, because most shareholders will share across a vast range of the stock market, companies in the stock market. So if you're asking on a company by company basis, then that's quite a long conversation, which you'll probably never get to the bottom of. Check out their policies first. If you've got concerns about a specific company, then it is worthwhile asking about that company, but then your question is likely to be, well, how does that investment in that company stack up to your policy?
Great, thank you. I'm afraid we're rapidly running out of time, but I would just highlight something that our friend Daniel from the Quakers has put in the chat about Quakers, if you're interested in getting this issue on the agenda of your local and area business meetings. I'm sure Quakers will know how to do that, but if not, then I'm sure if you contact Daniel or someone at Friends House in London, then they'll be able to help you. So I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our meeting this morning. I hope everyone has enjoyed it and found it as worthwhile as I have. Lucy will be sending around an email in short order where you'll be able to get in touch if you've got any further questions or want to continue the discussion, and this recording of the session will be going online soon, so please feel free to share with others who couldn't make it this morning or who you think would be interested. It just leaves me to thank Farah, Justin, Kate and Steve for your fantastic contributions. to thank Lucy from Joint Public Issues team for all the hard work she's done behind the scenes in organising it. And I also noticed we've got Robert Harrop and Daniel Jakupovic from the Nuclear Weapons Finance Research Group here as well. So thank you for all the hard work you've done on this report, and Teresa Alessandro there, who was involved for a long time and did some fantastic work. So I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. I hope you are enjoying the sunshine, and don't forget to write to your financial institutions, because it really will make a difference. Thanks for coming, everyone. See you soon.